a pretty consistent line among the progressive work ethic thinkers is that you ask, well, who's doing all the work around here? Like, society should be for them. The rules of society should be for the workers, not for the idle rich. They didn't object to poor law provision because they're very confident that if you provide decent opportunities for people who are able-bodied, that those people will, of their own free will, want to work. The critical issue is, do they really have an opportunity to improve their well-being through work? And in order to do that, wages have to be good.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. We're going to move on from Locke. But a funny thing happens on the way from Locke to the next thinkers. There's kind of a Cambrian explosion. Up until now, we've been able to follow a thread that was kind of linear. And Locke introduced a lot of things. The really important thing that you say about Locke is that Locke's essential belief is not one of everybody should be free, sort of the libertarian approach. It is anchored primarily on the work ethic, and the work ethic is good for others, and it can include limiting of positive rights. And he's agnostic as to whether you're the idle rich or the idle poor. Idleness is still vice. And now, the big split that we're going to follow in the next section is a split into progressives and conservatives. On the progressive side, we've got Adam Smith. There's a whole crew of Ricardian socialists. There's the Marquis de Condorcet, quite a lovely thinker.
Yes.
Bit of an intellectual crush on somebody I'd never heard of before. John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx. So that's over on the progressive side. And on the conservative side, we have Joseph Priestley, Jeremy Bentham, Thomas Malthus, Edmund Burke, William Paley, Richard Whately, Nassau Sr., which, by the way, there's more on that side, but I think that's not a completely representative sample. And a big split happens between these two different sides. And by the way, I assume all of these people are arguing with each other.
Correct. Everybody knows everybody. It's remarkable what a small world the intellectuals in England and Scotland were. They're having dinner at each other's houses. They're debating each other. They know each other personally.
Yes. So we see a couple of big changes here. One is the change where the conservative half has a tendency to say, idle poor bad, idle rich okay. And the progressive side says a little bit more. First of all, there aren't any idle poor. It's not many idle poor. The poor really work, and idle rich bad. Is that the main distinction between these two?
I would draw the main distinction somewhat differently. And that is a pretty consistent line among the progressive work ethic thinkers is that you ask, well, who's doing all the work around here? Like, society should be for them. The rules of society should be for the workers, not for the idle rich. That's really the biggest theme. We got to make sure that the workers have a decent life, and that's the vast majority of people. And for the most part, they're not that worried about the so-called idle poor. They think, well, maybe there's a few of these people, but they're not even remotely the bulk of the poor. You don't really have to worry too much about them. They didn't object to poor law provision for the most part, because they're very confident that if you provide decent opportunities for people who are able-bodied, that those people will, of their own free will, want to work. The critical issue is, do they really have an opportunity to improve their well-being through work? And in order to do that, wages have to be good. That's the critical issue. They think if you see idle people around, it's probably because work isn't paying. And they were very, very skeptical of the idle rich, especially the heirs of the idle rich. So it could have been that, say, the first generation, you have somebody who works really hard and builds a fortune. That's not uncommon in this era. But then, of course, they pass on that fortune to the firstborn son. And who is that guy? Well, typically he's been raised in a coddled environment, educated by tutors, and had a fancy idle life and has horses and things like that, right? And what good is he? Why should he get the entire estate? So there's a lot of skepticism on the progressive side to the inheritance laws, which locked up the big aristocratic estates and passed them on whole to the firstborn son. That's just corrupt. What has the firstborn son done to earn all this? Nothing. They're just getting it for free. Whereas the conservatives, they see all the poor out there. And they think, well, because they infer from the fact that they're poor, that they must be sinful. Look, these horrible people, they're wallowing in sin. And then they blame the poor law for that. They said, well, they're wallowing in sin because, well, they could just go to the local parish, say that they're poor, and then they'd get a free handout. No wonder they're lazy, right? Welfare is making them lazy. So we should cut back on welfare or maybe abolish it altogether, as Malthus said, and that would force people to work. Or maybe you should set up workhouses and force people to enter them as a condition of getting any kind of poor relief at all. And that was the premise of the so-called new poor law, which basically aspired to a condition in which the only way people could get poverty relief is by entering a workhouse where they would be forced to work.
This is a thread we're going to follow going forward, which is coerced labor.
Mm-hmm.
We started talking about it with the sort of the rules of slavery before. Part of the reason I originally found your work as I was tracking down coerced labor in prisons in the modern United States. That's how I found your work. So it still absolutely exists.
13th Amendment exception right there.
Right. But a part of it is, who do we think people are? And who do we think people who work are? On the progressive side, the idea is, for the most part, people who work are the people doing the good for society. We need to create an environment that is going to help them to flourish. And they have an assumption of, well, I mean, one of the things that happens here that I think is a big switch is that we stop talking about God so much.
Correct.
What's the big switch away from God? What do people start anchoring on instead of God?
By the late 18th century, a lot of political thinking has become very secularized, and especially on the progressive end. I do want to point out that the conservatives are still talking about God. A lot of them were church people, like Malthus, for instance, or Richard Whately. These are church people. Even Joseph Priestley, he was a Unitarian minister, as well as a very famous chemist. Most people know him as a chemist, but he was also a political economist.
Yes, he discovered oxygen, in fact. Thank you. Without him, we would have no oxygen.
But by the 18th century, people aren't thinking so much about God or trying to justify things in God's terms. So even Malthus, for instance, although he wrote these principles of population to justify the ways of God to man, as he said in his preface, he justifies his prescriptions in terms of political economy, a purely secular doctrine, even though he's a churchman and thinks that these are also God's laws. But he wants to make sure he has a pure economic rationale for this as well. And, you know, a lot of it is the 17th century. You had a massive civil war in the middle of the 17th century. People are arguing over religion. It traumatized the population. You got a lot of people killing each other over matters of church governance and should the Presbyterians really rule, the Church of England and things like this. And people kind of got sick of trying to ground arguments in political philosophy solely on the Bible, because people were endlessly bickering over how to interpret the Bible. It seemed irresolvable. And so shortly after that, you just see much more secular argumentation entering. And that came to dominate by the 18th century. And the rise of political economy is a sign of that. Let's just make pure economic arguments. And even Priestley, who's a churchman, argues in these terms. And so another critical distinction between the conservatives and the progressives is, what do you think is critical for getting people to work hard? The conservatives thought that people of different classes had different fundamental dispositions. And the other side, the progressives thought, no, everybody responds in the same way to incentives. You can trust them. This key, Adam Smith, he's on the progressive side. He says, look, there's no fundamental differences in people's dispositions to sin based on their class position. That's just ridiculous. It's just a matter of what incentives they face. If you give people positive incentives so that they can improve their life prospects by working hard, they're going to work hard. Trust them. They will use their liberty well. Whereas the conservatives were constantly worried that if you paid high wages to the poor, that they would quit working as soon as they had barely covered their subsistence because they hated to work because they're idlers by nature. And consequently, for the conservatives, the way to get the poor to work hard is to press wages down so that they have to work all the time just to barely get their heads above water. Whereas you could trust the upper classes to be serving society in some way without pressing down their compensation because they've already internalized the work ethic. That's the theory. And even the idle rich, they thought that the role of the idle rich was essentially to force the poor to work hard, right? So they're doing their job too, which is forcing everybody else to work hard. And that was the justification not only for the extraordinary exploitation of very poor workers, both in the factories and on the farms, but also the justification for imperialism. The argument was that those idlers abroad, they're just savages. They'll never learn disciplined work unless we force them into it.
On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com. I noticed, and this is something I would like to keep track of, which is that the words that people use to talk about poor people who work, I noticed beast, savage.
It's demonizing, dehumanizing language.
Yeah. And Malthus seemed to have a particular influence over thinkers on both sides. I noticed this, which is that on the progressive side, people still kind of took it as an assumption that the reason people are poor is because they've reproduced beyond what there is work to do, and that is associated with a lack of self-discipline.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Malthus really is a pivotal figure. He wrote the Principles of Population in order to justify his critique of the welfare state, that is the poor law. And his argument is an argument that's very familiar today, which is that if you give free stuff to poor people so that they can support their kids, all you're doing is you're promoting licentiousness. Well, then, as was said in the debates over the abolition of AFDC, welfare for single moms, essentially, and their kids in the United States. These debates took place during the Clinton administration in the 90s, that the availability of cash support for single moms would just encourage them to have more kids than they could afford to support. And that was Malthus's argument, that you're never going to get the population out of poverty if you have the poor law, because people will have so many kids that they'll press wages down through overpopulation excess supply of labor is going to push wages down. And so everybody will be perpetually in poverty because the poor are failing to restrain their reproduction. Malthus argued that you have to give them a very negative incentive not to do that. The idea would be to force them to marry late. Then they'd have fewer kids. And so the idea is take away welfare, and then they won't be getting married. Well, like you won't have young women getting married at the age of 16 and having kids right away. Maybe they would wait until they were in their late 20s, and then you'd have fewer kids. Just here, of course, the assumption is they're not having premarital sex, which was largely true, I have to say, in those days. Very strong social norms against premarital sex in Malthus's
and
day.
very early marriages, which, helps.
Yeah. No, in fact, the English had already, even under the Poor Law, been postponing marriage. They were marrying later than in Europe. Even though the Poor Law existed in England, it didn't exist in Europe, any part of Europe. So Malthus's own data actually cast some doubt on his argument that the Poor Law was somehow promoting the having of children that one couldn't afford to have. But he was still wringing his hands over the fact that you had these poor people who have kids they can't afford to support on their own income.
And one has this sneaking suspicion that all these sort of Oxford and Cambridge dons were just didn't like the idea of all that sex.
Yeah.
You had this sneaking suspicion that they liked. In fact, this is one of the things I noticed a lot on the conservative side was that there was an awful lot of hate toward the poor. Contempt
more than hatred. Yeah.
Contempt is a good word. It was mixed up with sin. It was mixed up with sex. It was certainly not mixed up, but directly relatable to the work ethic, which is that we're afraid that they will not be virtuous if we don't coerce them into labor.
Correct. And also chastity. That's the thing. So
and
chastity is part of the asceticism of the Puritans, right? No fun. Sex is a kind of fun. We don't want that.
Right. And one of the things that I think about often, that we often forget, is that contempt, I'll say hate, but it depends, feels good.
Oh, it does. I agree. Contempt is from a standpoint in which one assumes that one is superior to the person one holds in contempt. And that feeling of self-superiority is, right, people enjoy that.
And so I felt this kind of orgy, this kind of self-indulgence at the level of contempt expressed by some of the writers on the conservative side. And in particular, Nassau Sr.
Mm-hmm.
And this started to have really, really concrete effects, which is that decision makers on the conservative side were very influential during the potato famine. Let's go deeper into the conservative side, and let's do that by talking about how the conservative policies manifested during the potato famine.
Okay, the essential background to the potato famine is the great contrast between the way agriculture worked in England by the middle of the 19th century when the potato famine happened and how agriculture was organized in Ireland. By the middle of the 19th century, England has a completely capitalist form of agriculture. It's a three-class system. You have the landowners, they own all the land. You have the farmer, those are the capitalists. The capitalists, basically what they have is a pile of cash. They're farmers. Okay, what they do is they hire farmhands who are destitute agricultural laborers who are hired just for the season, just for the growing season. Imagine how poor they are, because what do they do in the wintertime when nothing's growing? They are starving practically. And what the farmer does is the farmer organizes agricultural production. Typically, it would just be a single crop on a gigantic farm. With their pile of cash, they use that to advance wages to the farmhands so that they could buy food and support their families. Then their workers harvest the crop. And the farmer now has to sell that crop, hopefully for a profit. The farmer then is taking enormous risks because they've already advanced all these wages. So now they have almost no cash left. And they had better be able to sell that crop for a profit so that they can survive for the next year. So that's the three-class system. Okay, the farmer takes all of the risks and has nothing but capital, like cash, literally. The farmhands are just living barely above water. And the landlords are collecting the rents. In Ireland, the system was completely different because you did not have a class of capitalist farmers. Well, you do, but they were small. What you had was landlords and peasants. The peasants, they're living off the potato. So the potato was an import from the New World. And the miracle of the potato is that it's almost a complete food. And you plant it at the beginning of the growing season, and then you just have potatoes that are popping up with no additional labor. It's not like wheat where you have harvesting and threshing and all this intensive harvest season. Now the potatoes are growing for the whole season. You just dig up a few for your meal that day, and there's still more underground. Potatoes are an insanely productive crop. On a quarter acre, you could support a large family living off potatoes. If you had one cow, that would supply you with milk. And milk plus potatoes is a complete diet. It's almost stunning. So the peasantry, basically, with very little labor, could support large families on a quarter acre plot in Ireland. It's mind-boggling that this was possible. So they're desperately poor. They have almost no cash. You'd look into their cottage, which would be little better than a mud hut with a little thatch on the roof. One room, there would be barely a stick of furniture inside there. They would have one outfit to wear. They're desperately poor, but boy, were they well nourished. Potatoes plus milk. They were actually some of the healthiest people in Europe because their diet was a complete diet, no malnutrition. Now, the thing is that those peasants, there was a large population that was growing in Ireland at the time of peasants. And they're desperate. Every year they would have to bid again. They didn't have 99-year leases the way the 17th century English yeomen did. No, they had 11-month leases and quarter acre plots. So they're desperate, right, to support their families, which are growing. They have to keep on bidding every year for a new lease. And so they're bidding up the prices constantly in desperation because otherwise the whole family would starve. As a result, they're deeply in debt and they never get out of debt, ever. But as Mill pointed out, John Stuart Mill, a great political economist as well as a great philosopher, once you're so deeply in debt that there's nothing you can do to get out of it, there's no more incentive anymore to work hard. Really, you're only going to work enough to keep your family's heads above water because anything else you earn would just go to paying off your debt. It wouldn't go to you personally, right? And so the incentives are very perverse in this system. The English, who of course were running Ireland at the time, Ireland was functionally a colony of England, even though technically speaking, England and Ireland were united in a common kingdom. But in reality, Ireland was basically controlled by England. The conservative work ethic people looked at this Irish agricultural system and they said it's making the peasants idle. The potato, they complained, was the idle crop, right? Because you could feed your family with almost no work at all off the potato. And they didn't like this inefficient system where you had idle, lazy landlords dividing their estates into quarter acre plots for lazy peasants. They thought that this was just indulgence on both sides, both for the Irish aristocrats and for the Irish peasants, right? Nobody's working hard. No wonder Ireland is so poor. That's how they were thinking. And so what they wanted to do was to convert Ireland to the capitalist system of farming, the three-class system, where you'd actually have an energetic capitalist farmer who may well actually own the estate, but they would have to be energetic owners, not idle rent collectors. People who are investing in new farming technology, innovating, working really hard to turn a profit, not just living off rents and maybe gambling or doing other idle things, but somebody who's really hustling and trying to improve their estate. That's what they wanted for Ireland. And the question was how to get there. Well, it happened that just through sheer accident, a fungus infected the potato crop basically in the 1840s. This starts happening. And the fungus is devastating. It just destroys the potato crop. And suddenly you have all these starving Irish because they're living off potatoes. So the ones who are dependent on potatoes, they're starving because the potatoes are rotting. You've harvested them and you have your potatoes in a cellar. And even after harvest, the fungus would just turn them into mush. Okay. They didn't have any way to prevent this. So suddenly you have a starvation problem and calls for charitable relief to the Irish so they don't starve. But the advocates of the conservative work ethic, like Nassau Senior, and people coming out of the Treasury Department of England who were managing famine relief, saw this as an immense opportunity to clear the estates of all of these idle peasants and prevent them from getting a lease on the land. There are many experiments tried, but the ultimate one was that in order to get access to a soup kitchen, essentially, you would have to give up your lease on a quarter-acre plot. Your cottage would be torn down. And the idea was you just force them out of Ireland. There was overpopulation. And indeed, you had millions of Irish leaving Ireland, going to America, Canada, Australia, primarily. And that's the source of the enormous number of Irish immigrants to the United States in the 1840s and even into the 50s. They're still coming in.
And so I know Whately, Nassau Senior were two big players in the policies there. Nassau is quoted as, I don't think this was in your book, but it may have been, that the famine would not kill more than 1 million people, and that would scarcely be enough to do much good.
Yeah, that was in my book. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, is it in your book?
Yes. No, it's scandalous, right? They were absolutely ruthless. But think about it. If you believe in Malthus' story, overpopulation will lead to famine and kill off people to re-equilibrate the supply and demand for labor. That was the picture. It was inevitable anyways. So let it happen fast with the famine, and then maybe we can move to a capitalist style of agriculture, which they assumed would be more productive.
In part, more productive because a capitalist who owned the land would say, I'm only going to give you a little bit of money, and so you're going to have to work a lot harder.
Correct. Yes.
Than you were.
You didn't have your own lease. You didn't have rights to your own land to farm. You would be entirely dependent on wage labor. So the idea is to convert peasants to wage laborers on the farms, and then they would have to work really, really hard.
And then to scrimp on the wages so that they become more virtuous.
Correct.
Let's talk about some of the specific policies. So one of the specific policies was, look, we'll give you some food if you give up your land, your lease. Workhouses were involved?
Yes. Before the famine, Parliament extended the poor law to Ireland. Before then, in England, you had the so-called new poor law. The difference between the old and the new is that the standard form of poverty relief under the old poor law was so-called outdoor relief. That is, you would just hand cash out to people, but then they would still be able to live in their little cottages. Okay, and you would just give them enough to feed themselves. The problem with outdoor relief is that the conservative work ethic people thought, well, you're just giving a free handout and people could still have a relatively comfortable life in their own home. You want to deter idleness. And so you have to make access to welfare something very unpleasant. So the new poor law which was passed around 1832 or 1834, I can't remember exactly, that aspired to a condition in which the only way you would be able to get relief from destitution was so-called indoor relief. Indoor relief meant you would have to enter a workhouse in order to get fed. Now, the workhouses were horrible, horrible places. It was places of slavery. You would not be permitted to leave. You had no civil liberties. You lost all of your civil liberties. Men and women were separated, so no more sex. Families were broken up. Absolutely oppressive. And it was deliberately made degrading. So much so, it's shocking even to contemplate. So people in the workhouses were not given forks and spoons to eat from. It is pure degradation. Even prisoners got forks and spoons. But there was such great suspicion that people would have an incentive to get free stuff that they deliberately made the workhouses degrading to deter people from cheating. There was all the suspicion that all these cheaters would just be going in there to get free stuff. So they made the conditions degrading in order to deter that. So that's indoor relief. Now, in practice, though, and this had been known already for a long time, because you even had a very few workhouses in the 17th century, is that workhouses are insanely expensive to maintain. And you could never get these poor people to work so hard as to make a profit for the workhouse. So, you had to hire people to supervise all the poor. You have to build structures. You have to create make work, which involves buying materials and so forth. It's much more expensive than just handing out cash that could cover people's bread expenses. And so there was a constant conflict among managers of the poor laws because you have to raise taxes much higher just to cover the administrative expenses of running a poorhouse compared to just outdoor relief. And so you have a constant fluctuation between saying, well, we have to do this to prevent idlers from cheating us and to deter people from even asking for relief unless there's absolutely no other way. So we have to put them in workhouses on the one hand, but then on the other hand, taxpayers saying, but this is super expensive. It's so much cheaper. We could cut our taxes if you just had outdoor relief. And so you find welfare policy cycling between these two options all the time, and neither one is satisfactory. And scandals break out because people who are confined to workhouses are subject to all kinds of horrific abuse, including the children who are also confined. And then the papers would report on these horrible cruelties to which the poor were subject, including the kids. So you have Dickens talking about this and how just gratuitously cruel and degrading it is to be in these workhouses. So you have constant cycling between those policies, between outdoor and indoor relief. In practice, outdoor relief was quite common even after the new poor law was enacted. And in Ireland, they forced this creation of workhouses, but everyone knew at the time that if there was some famine due to crop failure, the workhouses, you wouldn't have nearly enough to collect in all of the poor. It was just delusional. And people knew ahead of time that the workhouse system would never be able to provide for the needs of all of the destitute in case of a famine. So when famine hit, and you have this additional project of using the famine to clear the peasants from the land, what happened was the creation, as people were forced to give up their quarter-acre plots and their cottages were torn down, you had a creation of a mass population of homeless people. And the workhouses didn't have remotely the capacity to accept all of these homeless people. And keep in mind that the climate, right, it's rainy. And in the wintertime, it is cold. And if there's one thing everybody understands, it's that if you're cold and dry, you can simply bundle up and you can still survive. But if you are cold and wet and starving, you will die. your body doesn't have enough calories in it to shiver and keep yourself warm, right? You're exhausted, vulnerable to disease of various sorts if you've been malnourished for a long time, right? So you have mass death in the wintertime, in no cottages anymore, and not enough beds in these little workhouses to remotely cover everybody's needs. And in fact, the workhouses are crowded with vulnerable, starving people. So disease breaks out because they're crowded in unsanitary places. You can imagine if some respiratory disease breaks out, everybody gets it and they're all dying because they don't have the bodily reserves to survive an infection.
It's a very complicated situation because it's mixed up with the policies, are mixed up with concern for people's souls, essentially, like for their virtue. It's mixed up with kind of a social engineering, which is we want to create a new system here, and we need to enforce the creation of that new system by making the current system unendurable during the famine and forcing people out of their leases. But it seems also to be tied up with who's going to pay for this. And one of the things that you mentioned is that there was a push for local landowners to provide relief.
Correct. And this is very important because the architects of famine relief, who are all coming from England, not Ireland. The famine relief is run out of the Treasury Department in London. And they're conservative work ethic people. They're the architects of famine relief, and Parliament as well, of course, but they're totally dominated by the English. Parliament is. They hate both the idle poor and the idle rich, right? That is the Irish landlords. They're friendly to the English landlords who they don't see as idle, but they think the Irish landlords are a lower class of aristocrat. They want to get rid of them too and replace them with more capitalist-minded, improving landlords. People are energetically trying to maximize their profits.
Were the landlords in Ireland also Irish?
Yes, they hated the Irish. They had absolute contempt for the Irish. If you want to know why the Irish still don't like the English, it's because that residual contempt is still there. And they also have historical memory of how awful it was. Because, they're really a colonized people.
And so the push to say, look, local landlords, take care of your local people was to some extent, don't redistribute our wealth to your poor.
Absolutely. So what was happening is that in the early years of the famine, a lot of money was flowing from England to Ireland for famine relief. But eventually the English say, well, why are we paying for this? The Irish should be paying for this. Those lazy Irish landlords should pay for it. So they used the recently enacted poor law that was passed before the famine that applied to Ireland. And they said, now it's time for Irish land to support the Irish poor, right? That is, the entire burden of famine relief should be placed on the landlords. But this was an impossible demand, and the landlords understood this because the economy was collapsing under the famine condition, and the Irish landlords didn't have the cash to relieve a huge percentage of the population of Ireland that's starving. They weren't rich enough. And the English said, too bad for you. We want you to go bankrupt. And then the English will buy up your land, and they're energetic capitalist landlords. And then they'll finally convert this backward system of farming to something on a more capitalist and more productive basis. So they wanted to also bankrupt the Irish landlords.
There's a funny little echo there of, I think it was one of the Bushes who argued for 1,000 points of light, which in the United States meant that essentially taking care of people who are less fortunate should fall to the local churches as opposed to the federal government. And a part of the argument there is that if it's the federal government, then we're going to have to tax people more, and that's going to involve a redistribution of wealth. Listen more carefully to that next time because of this.
But keep in mind, too, that in the United States, you have exactly the same problem. That because of the geography of inequality in the United States, you're basically asking extremely poor communities to take care of poverty relief, but they have almost no money. Just as the Irish landlords were just vastly less wealthy than the English landlords. They couldn't support all of the poor.
Yeah, one of the things that happens in California is that property taxes have a tendency to pay for schools. So Palo Alto, we almost moved over the hill, actually, from where we live to Palo Alto because teachers get paid 30% more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In the richest community in the Bay Area.
Right. Sure.
And my wife's a teacher. All right. So what was the outcome in Ireland?
So the outcome was you have about 1 million die. And in fact, the deaths actually go deep into the 1850s excess mortality, because if you've suffered through a famine situation, even if you get out alive, for a long time, you're vulnerable to infectious disease. So excess mortality is also killing them off even in the 50s after the famine is formally over. But you also had a lot of outmigration. Ireland's population crashed. And, from England's point of view, that was a good thing. And that's what makes it such a horrific tale of cruelty, because England was the richest country in the world at that time and could easily have afforded to support all the Irish poor. And indeed, the sum total of Irish famine relief paid by the English to Ireland was a small fraction of the amount of money that was spent compensating former slave owners for the fact that slavery had been abolished, and they were compensated for all their economic losses. So just think about that. And that was just a handful of slaveholders, in the thousands. We're not talking about millions of Irish. So all this stintingness towards the Irish poor, as if it was bankrupting the English, was absurd. It wasn't actually a major fiscal burden at all.
There were a couple of characteristics that you pointed out throughout all of this. One of them is stinting, which is stinting support for the poor, in part because of the belief that the poor should be forced to work for anything. But the second thing is, one of the other things was onerous bureaucratic hurdles, that even if there was some kind of a possible resource that could alleviate the challenges of the poor, we're going to make it just administratively so difficult to get that in reality, it's mostly not there.
Yes, and that still exists in the United States. You have insane amounts of paperwork to get access to all kinds of federal programs and state programs. The states get to write their own rules because they're really joint federal-state programs. Medicaid, cash relief of various sorts, food stamps. A lot of people applying for these things, they're just completely snowed by the paperwork. Federal financial aid for college.
FAFSA, that's called in the United States.
They actually had a major reform of FAFSA designed to make it easier, but they put it all online and the software ended up being a disaster.
Well, so just as an aside, I got so pissed at FAFSA because I couldn't figure out how to log in. I'm a high-tech person in Silicon Valley. Me and both of my kids couldn't figure out how to log into it. And so I got so frustrated that I was trying once again to create a user ID. And so I said, Dart fucking Lindsley. To this day, that's my user ID in FAFSA.
I don't understand this because we have such high technology, but somehow when big complex software gets rolled out, inevitably there's like millions of glitches and the thing crashes.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting study, which is to say, first of all, it's hard to build big complex things from scratch. Most of the big complex things we use have existed for ages.
Yeah.
And all of those glitches have been worn down. And they often start small and then they grow up. And so we try to do these big things. And then we hire contractors who, frankly, it's a lot. But I digress. So I'll tell you two things that I hope to get in at the very end of this conversation. One is prison labor in the United States. California just failed to pass a law that would ban coerced prison labor. That's California.
Yeah. So what was the vote? What was the percent?
I don't know. I can't look at this last election. If you want to know my response to the last election, it's mostly sitting over here in the corner of the garage going, meh, 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 meh. This is California, and California, we're still voting for coerced prison labor. How is that feasible, right?
It's because people are very frustrated by crime. They feel insecure, even though they have no idea what real high crime rates are. I mean, you and I, right? We were there in the 70s and 80s when crime was like seriously high. Crack cocaine stuff. Disorder in the cities was like much worse then than now. But people don't have long memories or they were born after that era.
One of the things that your book did to me is I'm basically saying, can't we all get along? Let's recognize that employees are customers, and then we'll run our businesses better and everything's going to be great. And I started reading your book and I said, oh no, there's actually a giant conspiracy. And my first response to whenever there's this idea of conspiracies is I think to myself, no, it's usually incompetent people, right? It's not actually a conspiracy. And so I went out and I went to look to see if I could find a conspiracy. 2 clicks, I found the freaking conspiracy. It's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is a lobbying group. And as a lobbying group, they lobby for essentially coerced labor. They're against transparency of business practices, including environmental practices. They are against laws that might prohibit non-compete clauses.
Oh, yeah. The Chamber of Commerce is the defender of every predatory practice of employers.
They are in favor of outrageous penalties on credit cards.
Yeah.
That's really incredible, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, is it a conspiracy if it's right there in 2 clicks?
Yeah, that's right. It's not really hidden, so it shouldn't be called a conspiracy.
It may still be a conspiracy, but it's not a secret one. So anyway, just being able to take these ideas and bring them down to real modern practices.
So you should actually, just about the Chamber of Commerce, you should read this great work by Mark Mizrachi, who's at University of Michigan, crossed between the business school and a sociology department. It's called The Fragmentation of the American Corporate Elite. And part of what he does here is he discusses how in the immediate post-war era, the corporate elite was actually more responsible than now, in a sense that they were willing to accept higher taxes in order to fund Eisenhower's highway program. Why? Because they recognize that there's a shared corporate interest in having highways so you can efficiently ship your goods anywhere in the country and unify the national market. Okay. But what happened was there was always a subgroup of America's corporate elite that just had seething resentment against the New Deal.
Yes,
they hated it.
That is so true.
Yes. Absolute loathing. And they just wanted all the money for themselves. Some of them were rather conspiratorial, like the John Birchers. They're very paranoid people, but also very resentful, full of grievance. And basically, they were the champions of Goldwater and then ultimately became the champions of Reagan. And their project was specifically to destroy every last element of the New Deal. So they destroyed the labor unions, who are no longer a significant force. Just one thing after another. They captured the courts. That's a Federalist Society, federal courts. Gerrymandering, like everything. They hate democracy. They hate the empowerment of anyone beneath them. They want to maximize their wealth. They got rid of, hot progressive taxes. One element of the New Deal after the other. One of the few elements remaining, of course, is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and they hate all that and they want to privatize that. At any rate, after Mizrachi's story, once they pretty much got everything they wanted during the Reagan administration, the elite no longer is willing to cooperate on big national projects that would help everyone. Now it's like every corporate elite just for themselves. And that's the fragmentation. And he thinks that is our current political moment is shaped by that. And it's marked in particular by the change in the Chamber of Commerce. This Chamber of Commerce used to speak on behalf of some collective shared interest. of the corporations, but now they're basically guns for hire. What they do is they provide cover for corporations like private prisons, the corporations that run the prison system. They'll just take cash and then be a useful front for some special interest that lobbies for some special thing. That's what it is now. But they used to have a more unified voice and think about shared interests of corporations and like American society more generally.
And American society. Okay, well, I'll put that in the list. It's weird. Started this podcast about work, and I thought it would be apolitical, forgetting for a minute that actually the last 5 centuries of politics have been about work. All right, thank you. This has been so interesting. It's such a good book.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.